Every flight, whether long or short, carries with it stories, journeys filled with dreams and aspiration. But sometimes, on these seemingly ordinary flights, unexpected events unfold, turning an ordinary day into a pivotal moment that not only changes one person's life, but could also set in motion a large-scale transformation within an organization. Alexander Grant, a 19-year-old college student at Westlake University in Chicago, didn't think of this flight as anything special. It was just a simple journey from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, where he was returning to school after the summer break. With his light backpack containing a few books, a laptop, and some comfortable clothes, Alexander wasn't carrying much, only a mindset focused on getting back to his studies and research. He wasn't someone who liked attention. Although he was the son of one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in the airline industry, David Grant, CEO of Meridian Air, Alexander always wanted to be independent and didn't want to rely on any privileges his father's position might afford him. He chose Westlake University over Harvard, not because he wasn't capable, but simply because he wanted to carve out his own path, separate from his father's shadow. That morning, as he entered the security check at Reagan National Airport, Alexander had no idea that this journey would become a turning point in his life. He smoothly passed through the security area, scanned his boarding pass without any issue, and stood in line, waiting for his turn to board the plane. It was a routine flight, with a few hurried passengers, some small families, and business people crossing paths in their sharp suits heading to their respective destinations. When it was his turn, Alexander boarded the plane. Everything seemed like any other flight. He handed his ticket to the female flight attendant near the door. She looked at him for a moment with a cold expression, but didn't say anything. With a small smile, Alexander showed his boarding pass and walked past her, unaware that he was about to become the target of an incident he could never have anticipated. His footsteps echoed in the narrow aisle as the plane gradually filled up. Alexander didn't pay much attention to the passing glances from the other passengers. He vaguely overheard conversations about business trips and vacation plans. When he found his seat at row 1 for A, he noticed a middle-aged man already sitting beside him. The man stood up, offered the seat to Alexander, said nothing, but nodded politely. "Thank you," Alexander said, sat down, placed his backpack on the floor, and fastened his seatbelt. The plane was getting ready for takeoff, but Alexander felt an inexplicable discomfort, a strange sensation, as if something was wrong. He looked around and saw another flight attendant walking towards him. This woman, a middle-aged person with a faint smile, began to check his boarding pass again. "Excuse me, may I see your boarding pass again?" she asked in a cold tone, with no warmth in her voice. Alexander was a bit surprised, but still took his boarding pass from his wallet and handed it to her. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice betraying his confusion. "Please wait a moment," the attendant said, turning and leaving him in a state of bewilderment. Alexander sensed something was wrong, but couldn't figure out what. The whole boarding process had gone smoothly, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He wondered if there was an issue with his ticket. Time passed, and the sound of the airplane's engines began to hum. But Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that brief interaction. His rational mind told him there was nothing to worry about, but the uneasy feeling kept growing. He glanced out the window, where luggage carts were rolling by, and the airport staff was busy preparing for other flights. Then, just when everything seemed to have settled down, the flight attendant returned. But this time, she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by a male attendant and the head of the flight crew. The tension in the air began to rise as they walked toward Alexander. He looked up and noticed they were staring at him with suspicion and inexplicable suspicion. "Sorry, we need you to gather your belongings and come with us now," the head flight attendant said. "What's going on?" Alexander asked, his voice no longer calm as before. "This is a security issue," the male attendant said, avoiding eye contact with Alexander. "You need to come with us for further checks." Without saying anything more, Everything moved quickly. Alexander was escorted off the plane, and all the passengers' eyes were on him. No one said anything, but they all watched as a young black man was taken off the plane with no clear reason. He walked down the aisle, feeling the weight of embarrassment and anger rising within him. But Alexander didn't speak. He just silently followed. As he stepped into the airport, those feelings intensified. But one thought kept running through his mind: had to call his father. The feeling of confusion and bewilderment from being dragged off the plane still lingered in Alexander's mind as he stood in the airport lobby. Though he tried not to show it, he could feel the silence from the passengers around him. Their gazes, though not directly focused on him, felt like sharp arrows, cold and judgmental. It was a feeling that couldn't be erased, a sense of loneliness he had never experienced, especially when standing among strangers. Alexander could feel his heart pounding, each beat as if it wanted to escape from his chest. He knew what he had to do next. This was no ordinary situation, and it couldn't just pass by like this. The words of the flight attendant and the captain still echoed in his ears, but the injustice he had suffered made it impossible for him to stay still. He couldn't stay silent. He couldn't let this be brushed aside as a minor incident. He pulled out his phone from his pocket, his hands cold as he dialed his father's number. In his mind, the image of his father, David Grant, came into focus. A powerful man, the CEO of one of the largest airlines in the country. David wasn't just a resilient father, but also a role model Alexander had always respected. However, today, Alexander didn't want to be just the child of a famous person who wanted to stand up for his own rights without relying on any protection his father could offer. The phone vibrated in his hand, and his father's deep voice came through the phone speaker. "What's going on, Alex?" "Dad," Alexander began, his voice thick with emotion. "They pulled me off the plane. They said there was an issue with my ticket, but I haven't done anything wrong. They treated me like I didn't belong there." Although he could only hear his father's voice, the firmness and calmness in David's words reassured Alexander slightly. David Grant, a man whom the entire airline industry respected, was now listening to his son. Every moment of silence made Alexander's heart sink. But his father's next words were a confirmation that he was not alone. "I'm not going to let this go easily," David replied, his voice unwavering. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." Never before had Alexander felt his father's protection so strongly. Not because of the wealth or power David held, but because of the determination and responsibility he always showed to his loved ones. Alexander could feel his father's strength through those brief words. It wasn't just an empty promise, it was a vow. When the call ended, Alexander sat down in a seat, his eyes drifting toward the other passengers. He no longer felt alone. A powerful sense, as if all he needed to do was stand firm and endure until his father arrived. But he also knew that this wasn't just a simple phone call. This would change everything. This would force his father to face a reality that no one in their family had ever anticipated. As he waited, Alexander's mind drifted back to the moment when he had boarded the plane. Everything had seemed normal, but now everything had a different shade. As a grown son, Alexander had always tried to face challenges on his own, without relying too much on his father's protection. He wanted to prove his worth by himself, but this time, the racism he had encountered had surpassed the defense of any young man. Alexander sighed, a wave of anxiety rising within him. Was this a personal incident, or did it reflect a larger issue within his father's company? Was this the consequence of some discrimination that had existed for a long time? Something his father had not realized. Questions swirled in his mind, but no matter what, he couldn't deny that this incident had made him reconsider what his father had built. Just then, Alexander received a return call from his father. "Alex, you don't need to worry. I've arranged everything. Get ready, because things are going to change from here." Hearing these words from his father, a powerful sense of calmness and peace enveloped Alexander. He knew that his father wasn't just someone who would help him, but someone who would never let him endure injustice without taking action. "I'll handle this," David said. And those words made Alexander feel a surge of strength within himself. At that moment, Alexander realized something important. This wasn't just a personal incident, it was a crucial turning point for both his father and Meridian Air. What his father would do next would not only impact Alexander, but also the values his father had built over the years in the airline industry. The story could be an opportunity to spark a revolution in the company's culture, not just in its growth but also in its social responsibility. When David Grant arrived at the airport, he was not just a father, he was also a powerful CEO, ready to face difficult decisions. No one could predict that a meeting at this airport would mark the beginning of a challenging journey, one that would bring about significant change not just for the company, but for society as a whole. David Grant walked into the airport, prepared to face whatever awaited him. David Grant walked into the airport with a determined stride, his gaze sharp as if he had already anticipated every possible outcome, showing no sign of worry. He was not a father who acted impulsively, but a leader of one of the largest airlines in the country. However, today, the situation was not only about his company, it was about the honor and dignity of his son. For him, this was not just a workplace issue. It was a battle for justice that he was ready to fight. As he passed through the check-in area and found Alexander waiting, his heart beat a little faster. Though he had mentally prepared himself for whatever situation lay ahead, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness seeing his son sitting there on it, just as any ordinary passenger, but as his son. Enduring an injustice, Alexander stood up immediately when he saw his father. His eyes betrayed a mix of joy, yet tinged with exhaustion, the tension still visible on his youthful face. "Dad," Alexander said, his voice a little weak but filled with determination. "They didn't just pull me off the plane, they made me feel like I didn't belong there. It's such a horrible feeling." David looked at his son, his gaze full of love, yet resolute. "You did well, Alex. You're not alone in this. I'm here now," he said, his voice calm but imbued with undeniable strength. "Now, we need to take action." The meeting between father and son was an unforgettable moment. Their words were not only words of comfort, but also a powerful commitment. David knew this was not just about protecting his son. It was an opportunity to reassess the company culture he had worked so hard to build. He decided this wouldn't be just a quick fix, it would be a long-term plan for comprehensive change. Immediately, David called his senior team. He requested an emergency meeting to address the issue. But this wasn't going to be just a routine discussion. He demanded that everyone involved in the incident be present, including the head flight attendant, Heather, and the security staff. He also requested a full review of the airport security procedures and the training program for Meridian Air's airline staff. David knew that this was an opportunity to clarify everything, but he also wanted to use this event as a catalyst to transform the company's culture, starting with the smallest details. If racism could occur even on a flight of his own company, he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He decided that he would not just ask for an apology, there would have to be a revolution in how the company treated both its customers and its staff. The meeting proceeded quickly and was charged with tension. Everyone was present, exchanging glances, the silence heavy in the room. When David entered the meeting room, all eyes turned toward him. But he didn't care about their gazes, because he knew he was doing the right thing. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "Today, I want you not only to explain what happened, but also to reconsider our entire process and company culture." The head flight attendant and Heather began presenting their side of the incident, explaining their suspicions about Alexander's behavior. They defended their actions by saying there were differences in Alexander's behavior compared to other passengers, but their explanations didn't convince David. He listened but said nothing, only observing their movements. "When I first heard about this, I was shocked," David said, his voice lowering. "The issue isn't Alexander's behavior. The problem is your attitude and how you handled the situation. Our passengers are not criminals. You have no right to judge them just by their appearance." David's words were a shock to everyone present. Some began to feel uncomfortable, while others tried to justify their actions. But David was unfazed. "I'm not here to criticize you," he said, "but I demand that you admit that racial discrimination, whether intentional or not, is unacceptable in this company. And if it happens, we must act immediately." After the tense meeting, David decided to implement a comprehensive reform within the company. He called for a retraining program for all employees, from flight attendants to security staff, focused on awareness and preventing racial discrimination. He wanted to create a work environment where all employees felt respected and treated fairly, not just toward customers, but also toward one another. Although still a student, Alexander was invited to be part of this project. David knew that, with his young perspective, Alexander would help push for the necessary changes. But more importantly, he wanted his son to not just be an heir to the company, but someone who could bring about groundbreaking changes from his own experience. "You will oversee this program," David told Alexander in a private conversation after the meeting. "You will help create a new training system, an environment where there's no room for racism or favoritism." Despite his youth, Alexander felt the weight of this responsibility. But he also understood that this was an opportunity not only to change the company, but also to create a model for the entire airline industry. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face the challenge. "You believe in me, and I won't disappoint you," Alexander replied, determination shining in his eyes. From that day forward, not only did Alexander's life change, but so did Meridian Air. The changes began within the company, and no one could have anticipated that an event that seemed so small could trigger such a large-scale revolution. David Grant, a man always known for his firm leadership, was now leading a change that would not only reshape his company, but also the way society viewed racial discrimination. A week after the incident on Flight 187, the atmosphere at Meridian Air had grown more tense than ever. All attention seemed to focus on the reform that David Grant had decided to implement. Major changes were never easy, and despite being a man of power and experience, David knew that there would be many challenges ahead before his plans could become reality. But he also understood that this was an opportunity that could not be missed to bring about profound change. That day, David sat in his office, sunlight streaming through the large windows, casting light on a desk full of papers and documents. Despite the company being in the middle of a storm, with numerous calls and urgent meetings, he still took the time to reflect. He wasn't just thinking about how to address the issues arising from the incident, but also about how to rebuild trust with both employees and customers. A crucial decision had been made in his mind, and today, he would act on it. David was not a man who delayed decisions. When he felt something was right, he acted immediately. That's why he called a meeting with the senior leadership team first thing that morning. Everyone had to be present. His leadership team, from the HR director, training manager, to the chief strategy officer, was all there in the meeting room. In particular, for this meeting, he invited Alexander, his son, to join. This wasn't an easy decision, but he wanted his son to be not just an observer, but an active participant in the reform process. This was an opportunity for Alexander to prove his leadership and capabilities. "We cannot go back to the way things were," David began the meeting, his voice strong and resolute. "What happened wasn't just a minor incident, it's a deeper issue, and I want us to change it from the roots. We will start with reforming the processes, but more importantly, we need to change the company culture." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. The leaders in the company knew that when David made a decision, it was irreversible. They understood that a revolution in the company wasn't easy, but with his leadership, they were ready to join the fight. "We'll start by implementing a new training program for all employees, not just the flight attendants, but also for senior staff within the company. Everyone will be trained on awareness and how to deal with discrimination. Whether intentional or accidental, I want all of you to participate in this process. David continued. Alexander sat next to his father, feeling the weight of this decision. This wasn't just an opportunity for him to learn from his father, but also a chance for him to make a difference. He looked around the room at the people who were listening intently to every word his father spoke. But none of them knew that this journey wasn't just about the company, it was about the forgotten people in society. As the meeting concluded, David turned to Alexander and gave him a light pat on the shoulder. You will be the one to oversee this program. You'll help me make important decisions about the training program and ensure that every employee in this company is involved in this process of change. Alexander looked at his father, his eyes filled with both concern and determination. He hadn't expected to be entrusted with such a big responsibility. Dad, I'll do my best, Alexander replied, his voice soft but confident. The next day, David and Alexander went together to a special meeting room to discuss the training program with the training team. This was an important meeting where they would start planning the anti-racism training program for the entire company. All the training directors from various departments were present. From flight attendants to security staff, all needed to learn how to recognize and deal with racial discrimination in the workplace. We will start from the roots, David said, looking each person in the room in the eye. We cannot accept discrimination, whether it is intentional or accidental. We need to create a fair environment for everyone, where people can work without fear of being treated unfairly. David's words made everyone in the room feel the importance of this reform. None of them could deny that these issues had existed within the company for a long time, but now they were faced with a big decision. Were they willing to change? After the meeting, the new training program was officially implemented. Every employee in the company had to attend this training, with no exceptions. The program didn't just teach how to identify racism. It also helped people understand the impact of discrimination on those affected. It wasn't just about skill training, but about changing mindsets, helping them realize that racism could never be accepted in any situation. Alexander, though young, with his decisiveness and sense of responsibility, worked alongside his father to create a training program that no one could deny the value of. He not only learned from his father but gradually became a leader in this reform. His decisions and the plans he put forth weren't just about short-term change, but about ensuring that the company would always be fair and respectful to everyone. As time passed, the changes began to take hold, and the results that David and Alexander had hoped for slowly became a reality. The company was no longer a place where discrimination was tolerated, but a place where everyone could work in an environment of fairness and respect. These actions weren't just about resolving one incident, but a grand strategy to change mindsets, reform culture, and create a just future for all of Meridian Air's employees. With every step they took, David and Alexander grew more certain that the path they had chosen was not only the right one, but also an important leap forward in eliminating racism and creating a more just workplace and society. Several months had passed since David Grant and Alexander began implementing training programs and cultural reforms at Meridian Air. The company had started to change, but David knew that change was never easy. Shifts in mindset and inclusion. We not only create a fair working environment, but also open up opportunities for everyone in the company. A fair environment is the foundation for creativity, innovation, and continuous development. The conference room was silent, everyone deeply thinking and reflecting on David's words. What he said wasn't just theory. It was a strong and profound commitment to a fairer and more transparent future for the company. After David finished his speech, he moved on to the part everyone had been waiting for. Alexander would present the initiative he had developed with his father. With growing confidence, Alexander stepped onto the stage. Though young, the months of working together with his father had taught him much about leadership, perseverance, and how to address major issues within the company. "We're not stopping at just changing the training processes," Alexander began. "We want to create a workplace where everyone can give their best without fear of discrimination, where no one is judged by anything other than their skills and true contributions." Alexander shared in detail the training courses he had developed, which included lessons on racial awareness, gender discrimination, and the importance of viewing people based on personal qualities rather than societal prejudices. He also emphasized that this was not a short-term program, but a continuous process that would be constantly improved. "We don't just want to create an inclusive workplace. We want to be a model for other companies to learn from," Alexander said, his eyes filled with confidence and passion. "We want every employee here to be not just a worker, but someone who contributes to building a fair and strong community." When Alexander finished his presentation, the conference room erupted in applause. His words not only touched the hearts of those present, but also sparked change within them. They knew that this journey wouldn't be easy, but they also understood that if they didn't start now, these positive changes would remain nothing more than a dream. The conference ended, but for David and Alexander, it was only the beginning. They had much more to do to bring these initiatives into reality, to make them an integral part of the company's daily operations. The changes would take time, effort from all employees, and relentless patience from the leadership. Looking at his son beside him, David felt a deep sense of pride. He knew that, although his son was young, with determination and passion, Alexander would be the one to continue his work in building and developing Meridian Air in a completely new direction of fairness, diversity, and inclusion. That event wasn't just a simple conference, it was a major turning point for Meridian Air. It was the moment when everyone involved began to realize that changing the culture wasn't easy, but if we set out to make it happen, everything could change. Under David and Alexander's leadership, the company would not only become a symbol in the aviation industry, but also a shining example for other organizations in building a fair and inclusive working environment. This reform wasn't the work of one person, it was the work of a whole team. And though many challenges lay ahead, David and Alexander knew they were ready for the next steps, not just for the company, but for a fairer world. A month after the conference, the atmosphere at Meridian Air remained tense, but there were also visible signs of change. The anti-racism training programs had started to show results. However, not everyone in the company was enthusiastic about these changes. Some longtime employees felt insecure, fearing that their past actions would be judged and criticized. Change, no matter how well-intentioned, always faces resistance from those who are reluctant to adapt. David sat in his office, looking out the window. Although he could see the success and clear progress, he still felt an unspoken concern. Change wasn't just about implementing new processes. It was about changing the mindset of every individual. The people he had built this company with had to adjust to a new working environment, one where discrimination no longer had a place. But David was not one to easily back down. He knew that this change was necessary, not just for the company, but for everything he had built. He knew he couldn't let the conservatives stand in the way of this progress. And he also knew that his son, Alexander, would be the one to help him achieve this goal. That day, David called Alexander into his office to discuss the next course of action. "We are at a major turning point, son," David began, his voice betraying a hint of worry. "Although the training programs are up and running, some employees are still not ready to change. Some feel that these changes are threatening their positions and benefits within the company." Alexander listened carefully, his eyes fixed on his father. He knew that this change wouldn't be easy, but he also understood that this was a crucial moment to determine whether they had the perseverance to pursue their long-term goals. "Dad, I think it's time we face them directly," Alexander said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "We need to create opportunities for dialogue, for them to understand that change is necessary and not a threat. They need to see that this is not an imposed change, but one that benefits everyone." David nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "I agree. But Change is never easy, and there will always be those who feel threatened. Whenever there's such a big change, there will be people who don't want to face it. I understand, Alexander replied, but if we don't act, the company will forever be stuck in old habits. While the world around us is changing every day, we need to lead this change, not just with our employees, but with our customers and partners as well. A few days later, David decided to hold a company-wide meeting where all employees would have the opportunity to speak directly with the leadership. The goal of this meeting wasn't just to announce upcoming changes, but to create a space where employees could express their thoughts, concerns, and questions about the ongoing transition. Alexander stood beside his father in the meeting room. This was his first opportunity to directly participate in such an important dialogue. He was not only David's son, but also a leader in his own right, someone who had to face and handle the resistance from employees. This conversation would play a crucial role in determining how the company would move forward. David opened the meeting. Dear colleagues, today we are not just a company. We are a community working together to build a better future. We've made great strides in creating a fair environment, one where there's no discrimination and where we all have equal opportunities. But I know that change is never easy. So today, I want to hear from you, the people who live and work in this community. Please share with us your concerns and thoughts. A heavy silence filled the room. Employees glanced at each other, hesitant about taking the rare opportunity to speak up. After a few seconds, a middle-aged woman, the head of the HR department, stood up. David, I understand what you're doing, and I agree that change is necessary. But I have to admit that I'm struggling to implement these new regulations. We've been working with the old processes for years, and now everything is changing. This is making many people in the company feel unsafe. Another silence spread across the room. Alexander knew that she wasn't just representing herself, but also the employees who were anxious and uncertain about the changes. He looked at his father and realized that this was the moment he had to speak up. I understand that change isn't easy, Alexander said, but we can't keep standing still. The world around us is changing every day, and we, as a major company, need to adapt. What's important is that we all understand that this change isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity for us to grow stronger. He looked into the eyes of everyone in the room and continued, we have to learn to see each other through our abilities and personal qualities, not through any societal prejudices. Only then will this company be able to develop sustainably. The meeting went on for several hours, and not all the questions were resolved immediately. However, everyone realized that the changes David and Alexander were introducing were not an attack on old values, but an opportunity for the company to become stronger. Those who were afraid began to understand that they weren't being pushed out, but were being called to join in a collective journey. After the meeting, the reactions from the employees began to change. Although there were still some dissatisfied voices, the majority began to understand that the change was necessary. David and Alexander had created a space where everyone could discuss and listen to each other. And that was the first step toward building a truly fair and inclusive company culture. This change wasn't just about David and Alexander. It was the story of all the people in the company who would work together to overcome challenges and make Meridian Air a model of positive change in the airline industry. Although there would still be many difficulties ahead, David and Alexander knew that they were on the right path. A month after the pivotal meeting on the reform, the atmosphere at Meridian Air had undergone a noticeable shift. However, the road to change was far from smooth. Resistance still existed, and at times, it was even stronger than before. What David and Alexander were doing wasn't just a simple reform, it was a revolution, one that faced numerous challenges. But what was truly admirable was that despite the many obstacles, they remained steadfast and unwavering. That day, David and Alexander sat in their office, looking out the window. The sunlight filtered through the large glass panes, casting light over the stack of documents on the desk. The company was on the right track, but the undercurrents of resistance within the organization had not subsided. This was why, today, David had decided to hold an important meeting with the company's senior leadership team to reaffirm the direction they were heading in. In the morning, in the meeting room, David and Alexander stood before familiar faces, the HR director, the training director, and department heads. Each of them knew that these reforms couldn't be just words on paper. They had to translate into reality, producing tangible results. But no one could deny that these efforts were facing significant challenges. "We've made significant progress in the past months," David began the meeting, his voice deep and full of weight. "But I've also noticed that there are still considerable obstacles. Some employees, especially those who have been with the company for a long time, still aren't ready to accept this change." Alexander looked at his father, his eyes betraying a sense of concern. He understood that this was a crucial moment, a time when they not only had to solve pressing issues, but also address the anxiety and skepticism from those who had long been accustomed to the old ways of working. "That's true," Alexander said, his voice steady but resolute. "We've started to see results from the training programs and the changes in processes. But the issue isn't just changing a few policies or procedures. More importantly, we need to change how people in the company perceive these changes. We need to help them see that this change isn't a threat, but an opportunity for greater growth." The meeting continued with feedback from the department heads. Some expressed dissatisfaction with the training programs, saying they felt too dry and didn't truly benefit their daily work. They felt pressured and feared that these changes might result in losing their freedom at work, or even worse, being judged more harshly than before. David listened to everyone speak, but he didn't let those reactions deter him. He knew this was a time to confront these challenges head-on. "We can't give up just because of a few obstacles. Every change takes time to become ingrained in people's mindset and actions. Our goal isn't to change everything overnight, but to build a sustainable culture where fairness and inclusion are prioritized." A few weeks after the meeting, David and Alexander decided to take another step. They organized a meet and greet between the employees and the leadership team, where everyone could directly share their thoughts, concerns, and hopes about the training programs and the changes in the company. The goal wasn't just to address workplace issues, but to create an open communication space where people could understand each other better and find common solutions. During the meet and greet, longtime employees began to share their feelings. A middle-aged woman from the HR department, her face filled with anxiety, stood up and said, "I understand that change is necessary, but I truly feel uncomfortable having to implement these new regulations. We've been working with the old practices for so many years, and now everything is changing. It makes me feel unsafe." David didn't rush to respond. Instead, he listened carefully to their concerns. Once they finished speaking, he addressed them. "I understand how you feel. No one wants to change if that change brings uncertainty. But I believe that if we don't change, we'll be stuck in the past, and we won't be able to grow." Alexander also joined the conversation, speaking with a deep understanding of his colleagues' concerns. "We don't want any of you to feel pressured or forced to change. What we're doing is building a fairer work environment, where everyone can contribute without worrying about being treated unfairly." Alexander's words acted as a catalyst, helping everyone begin to reassess the true nature of the change. Some felt relieved, while others remained hesitant. But at least they had begun to understand that this reform wasn't an imposition, but an opportunity for all to build a better workplace together. A few days later, the department heads began applying the new methods in their work. They didn't just continue with the anti-racism and fairness training. They also implemented lessons on self-awareness and how to improve relationships among employees. However, these changes weren't a one-way street. They required continuous effort from both leadership and employees. But moments like these made David and Alexander feel that the reform was truly worthwhile. A month later, looking back on the journey they had gone through, David realized they had achieved considerable progress. Although it wasn't an immediate, all-encompassing change, The first steps had created a wave of transformation in the company, reigniting trust and determination in those who had once doubted. The change at Meridian Air still had many challenges ahead, but for David and Alexander, they had already overcome one of the toughest phases. Together, they had sparked a new wind in the company, not just in the way work was done, but also in how people viewed, treated, and understood each other in the workplace. There were still many trials ahead, but with faith and perseverance, David and Alexander knew they were ready for the next steps. Summer came quickly, bringing the scorching heat and stifling air of the city. Yet, within the bustling atmosphere of Meridian Air, the temperature felt colder than ever. Over the past months, despite making considerable progress in the reforms, the challenges never ceased to threaten. Even though the company had changed significantly, there were still murmurs of hesitation, skeptical glances, and employees who, though not vocal, still felt uncomfortable with the changes. David and Alexander Grant stood firm amidst the storm, but they also knew that to truly build a solid foundation, they had to face the final challenge: how to truly change the perception and actions of everyone in the company. Only then could the reforms go deeper, creating a truly fair and inclusive environment for the long haul. Today, the day David had long awaited, had finally come. It was the day he would present the final report on the results achieved during the reform process. Although he had tried not to turn this into a test, this would be the opportunity to reflect on all they had done and make decisions on the next steps. David stood before the directors, department heads, and key employees in the company's large conference room, where everything had been meticulously prepared for the day. The space was formal, with soft lighting and long, neatly arranged tables. Everyone sat attentively, their faces filled with concern but also glistening with hope. They knew this was a pivotal moment for the future of the company. From the very first day we implemented these reforms, we knew this path wouldn't be easy. David began, his voice deep and steady. Not everyone will agree with us, and not everyone will see these changes as positive. But what we're doing is laying the foundation for a more just environment, not only within this company, but also in this industry as a whole. He looked each person in the room in the eye, without hesitation. So today, I want us to look back on the journey we've traveled. We won't just measure the change by numbers, but by how you feel and act. You are the ones who are truly making this difference. All eyes were on David. He had created a space where everyone in the company could feel the importance of this reform, not just as a surface-level change, but as a true transformation in how people viewed and worked with each other. After David presented the goals and the reasons behind the large changes, he moved on to the most important part of the meeting, sharing the results the company had achieved since implementing these initiatives. Before diving into the specifics, he cleverly shared a small story from one of the new employees in the company. There's a story I'd like to share with you. One of our new employees, from the flight attendant department, told me that she felt truly valued after participating in the diversity training program. Previously, she had felt overlooked at work due to mistaken assumptions about her gender and race. But after the training, she said she now feels she can contribute more, not just in her work, but also in creating a fairer working environment. David couldn't hide his pride when sharing this story. It was the clearest evidence that the changes in the company were beginning to take effect. But he also knew there was still much to be done. He continued into the specifics of the results. We've increased the percentage of women and employees from minority communities in leadership positions by 10% over the past 6 months. More importantly, we've created an open work environment where people feel comfortable expressing their opinions without fear of judgment. These numbers and results were a testament to the relentless efforts of the leadership team and employees. However, David didn't want to stop there. We can be satisfied with these numbers, but I want everyone to understand that creating this change isn't just about theoretical lessons. It's about action every day, from how we communicate with each other to how we treat our customers and the community. After David's presentation, he invited Alexander to share the next steps. With a calm but persuasive voice, Alexander continued the conversation. Although we've made significant progress, the work isn't finished. A reform like this can't rely solely on training programs or rigid processes. It requires the unity and commitment of everyone in the company. Alexander looked at the department heads, his voice serious. So, we will implement a new strategy to maintain and expand these results. We will organize regular workshops where everyone can share the challenges and experiences they face at work, and from there, help each other improve and learn. Additionally, we will introduce new initiatives on mental health care and workplace inclusion. The directors and employees in the room listened intently. Alexander's words weren't just an announcement, they were a powerful call to action, a reminder that this change was a long journey and required everyone's contribution. After the meeting, a new wave began to spread throughout the company. Those who had been fearful, doubtful, or even opposed to the changes now began to understand the importance of the shift. They no longer just saw the results in numbers, but felt the difference in themselves. The company wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a place where real change was happening. With the leadership of David and Alexander, the company wasn't just moving in the right direction, it was creating a powerful movement. The leaders within the company weren't just managers. They were those carrying the mission to change an entire generation of employees, inspiring them to be pioneers in changing the world of work. That day, David and Alexander didn't just mark a major milestone in the reform process, they also solidified the trust of everyone in a strong and fair company. This change wasn't the result of a single decision, but a series of consistent actions, long-term strategies, and strong commitments from the leadership. Meridian Air was no longer just an airline. It had become a model for all other organizations, a testament to the power of change and the ability to create a fair and inclusive environment. And with every step forward, David and Alexander knew they were on the right path, and that path would continue to open up new opportunities for everyone. Time passed, but the challenges faced by David and Alexander Grant never eased. Despite significant successes in the cultural reform at Meridian Air, the road ahead remained fraught with obstacles. The deeper they progressed, the more they realized that true change wasn't just about altering policies, procedures, or codes of conduct. It was a constant battle within the mindset and emotions of each individual in the company. To create lasting change, strategies alone weren't enough. The hearts and minds of the employees also had to change. One of the biggest challenges David and Alexander faced was the resistance from longtime employees, those who had worked with and been loyal to Meridian Air for many years. They felt confused and anxious about these changes, unsure whether the company would still retain the traditional values that had built its brand. Furthermore, some even believed that the reform wasn't necessary, arguing that the company was operating just fine and didn't need such extensive changes. One autumn day, in his office, David stared at the computer screen, scrolling through the latest progress reports. The numbers on the report showed positive changes. Employee participation in training programs had increased significantly, and internal surveys indicated that employee satisfaction with the work environment was gradually improving. Yet, despite the good results, David still carried a deep concern. He knew that the cost of this change wasn't just reflected in the numbers, but also in the inevitable losses that came with a transformation. That weekend, David decided to hold a private meeting with the senior executives and key leaders of Meridian Air. The goal wasn't just to update them on the progress of the reform, but to hear candid opinions from those who were directly facing these changes. The meeting took place in a quiet space, filled with tension, where no one wanted to criticize, but everyone was eager to express their opinions. "David, I truly respect what you've done," began the HR director, his voice deep but somewhat hesitant. "But I must admit that many people feel these changes have gone too far, and it's affecting the values that the company has built over many years." David listened without rushing to respond. He knew this wasn't the first time he'd faced such questions. But he also understood that if these concerns weren't addressed, his reform would struggle to succeed. "You're right," David replied, his voice firm but filled with understanding. "Any change will face resistance, especially when it touches upon the values we've long held dear. But I want you to understand that these changes are not about dismantling the old values. They're about evolving them. We cannot keep holding on to what's old without realizing that society is changing every day." Alexander, sitting beside his father, stood up and added, "We can't keep moving blindly and cling to outdated methods. Our company, though one of the leaders in the industry, still needs to move forward and innovate to meet the changing market. If we don't change, we'll be left behind." Alexander's words acted as a wake-up call for the executives in the room. Some nodded in agreement, but others still looked skeptical. The opponents of the reform were still there, and convincing them to change their views wouldn't be easy. But David didn't give up. He knew that changing the company culture was a long journey, and for them to succeed, they had to gain the trust of the key leaders. After the meeting, David and Alexander spent some time discussing the challenges they were facing. Alexander knew his father was always resolute and visionary, but the resistance from longtime employees was starting to wear on him. David seemed more reflective than usual. "You see, this change isn't just about numbers or new processes," David said. "The important thing is that we must change people's mindsets, and that's a much harder task." Alexander looked at his father, paused for a few seconds, then said, "I understand. But if we do nothing, we'll be stuck in the past. This reform isn't just about changing the company. It's about creating a fairer world for everyone. I don't want our company to just exist for the benefit of a few. I want it to represent fairness and inclusion." A few weeks after the meeting, David decided to take a more aggressive approach. He and Alexander together developed a plan to not only introduce new policies, but also create forums where employees could directly engage with the leadership about the unresolved issues and concerns they were facing. They organized smaller workshops within departments, inviting key employees to participate in solving specific problems within each unit. "We have to tackle the issues at their roots," Alexander said. "Don't let the concerns of a few departments become a major barrier to the company's progress." Both David and Alexander knew that this was a crucial time to reinforce the trust of the employees and demonstrate that this reform wasn't just benefiting a few, but everyone in the company. These workshops, though simple, were vital opportunities for everyone to share thoughts and feelings, and for the leadership to address the unresolved problems within the company. Finally, the first phase of the reform was completed, and although many challenges still lay ahead, David and Alexander knew they were on the right path. To change a company culture, bold and resolute actions were required. They had earned the trust of many employees and leaders in the company, and now, nothing could stop them from creating a stronger, fairer, and more inclusive Meridian Air. Although there were still difficulties ahead, David and Alexander hadn't wavered. Facing this final challenge, they became even more determined to take the company further, not just in business performance, but in the core values they had always believed in. 1 year after the reform, Meridian Air had come a long way. The decisions made by David and Alexander Grant were starting to bear fruit, bringing about significant shifts not only in the organizational structure, but also in how people viewed each other in the workplace. They had laid a solid foundation for comprehensive change, but the road ahead still held many challenges. That's why today, David felt a quiet anxiety settling in his chest. This was not just an ordinary meeting. Today, he would have to face the shareholders of the company, those who had not fully trusted this reform strategy from the beginning. Standing in his office, gazing out the window toward the airport, David couldn't help but reflect on the journey so far. He knew that, although they had achieved some notable successes, real change would only come when the shareholders who truly owned the company were united and had faith in the future that he and Alexander were building. That morning, the atmosphere in the Meridian Air conference room was more tense than ever. Over 20 shareholders had gathered, each with their own questions, concerns, and even objections. Over the past year, although the company had made considerable progress for them, the sweeping changes in organizational structure and work processes were still a point of skepticism that could not be easily overlooked. David and Alexander entered the room, their eyes filled with confidence, but also tinged with worry. This was the biggest challenge they had faced, and they knew that the decisions made today would not only determine the future of the company, but also be a test of their ability to protect the values they had been building. David opened the meeting in a calm voice. "We've been through a difficult but meaningful year. Although we've seen positive results in terms of cultural change and organizational reform, I understand that there are still many questions to be answered, and not everyone has been fully convinced by this strategy. But today, I want to share with you, directly and clearly, what we've done and will continue to do to ensure that the company will be stronger in the future." He looked around at the shareholders, some of whom had been with the company since its early days, and others who were new but were watching closely. Each glance, each question, was a challenge, but David wasn't discouraged. He knew that this was an opportunity to prove that the efforts he and his son had made were entirely worthwhile. Right after David's opening remarks, one of the largest shareholders, Mr. James Foster, head of finance at Meridian Air, stood up and asked right away, "David, I understand that these reform programs may bring long-term benefits, but we cannot help but worry about the costs. These changes have taken significant resources, and while we're seeing some positive signs, I must ask, can the company really maintain and sustain growth while reform costs continue to rise?" David smiled gently, understanding Mr. Foster's concerns. "James, I acknowledge that these changes aren't cheap, but I believe this is an investment worth making. We cannot continue to rely on outdated processes while society and the market are changing every day. What we're doing is not just improving the company's performance, it's building a fair and sustainable working environment where every employee has the opportunity to maximize their potential." Alexander, sitting beside his father, didn't let David stand alone in this conversation. He continued, "We are not just changing internal processes. We're creating a new image for the company of inclusion and fairness. This will not only attract top talent, but also help the company build stronger, more sustainable connections with customers and partners. We're building a strong foundation for long-term growth, not just short-term gains." Alexander's words helped ease some of the shareholders' concerns, but they still needed more concrete evidence of the effectiveness of these reforms. The next question came from Ms. Caroline Hayes, the marketing director of Meridian Air, who had always supported the reform strategy, but still wanted to ensure that what they were doing was right. "David, Alexander, I've seen the noticeable changes in the company's work environment. But how can we ensure that these changes don't just stay at the level of awareness, but actually translate into actions by every individual? We can hold training sessions, but how can we ensure that these changes are implemented in every decision made by each employee?" This was a question that both David and Alexander had thought about extensively. Reform wasn't just about changing processes, it had to involve changing the mindset and actions of each person within the company. David answered with confidence, "Caroline, you're right, and that's why we're not just focusing on training. We're also implementing systems to track and measure the effectiveness of these programs. We'll use specific metrics to monitor the extent to which these changes are being applied in daily work. Every employee will be evaluated not just based on their job performance, but also on how they align with the values the company is working towards." The meeting continued for several hours, filled with tension, but also a sense of determination. Gradually, the shareholders began to realize that, despite the difficulties, the path that David and Alexander had chosen was the right one. This change wasn't just about the company. It was about changing how each person viewed the company and how every employee would contribute to the collective growth. Values like fairness, inclusion, and mutual respect would no longer be just empty words. They would become the guiding principles in every operation at Meridian Air. With their decisive speeches and concrete strategies, David and Alexander gained the trust of the shareholders. They had proven that the company was not only changing on the outside, but also transforming at its core, from mindset to action. As the meeting ended, the shareholders no longer worried about continuing to support the reform initiatives. They saw the long-term vision of David and Alexander, and they realized that, although these changes brought many challenges, they also opened the door to a bright future for the company. Meridian Air would not only be a financially successful airline, but also a model for a sustainable, fair, and inclusive organization. David and Alexander stood together, looking out the window where planes continued to take off and land. They knew they had overcome a significant challenge and were ready to continue their journey of building a better company. With every step they took, they would bring change not just to the company but to the entire aviation industry, helping to create a fairer and more sustainable future for everyone. Their careers, though starting from struggles and challenges, had now opened a new chapter, a chapter full of hope, determination, and a desire to change the world for the better.